About a year ago, I made a video explaining how I came to the antinatalist conclusion. I now want to sort of follow up that discussion by briefly responding to challenges to the position that I've since then become more aware of. So perhaps the most common response that antinatalists get is that since humans are in some sense hardwired to reproduce, we can't expect to convince others not to reproduce. And consequently, all of this talk about antinatalism is ultimately of zero use. As common as this claim is, I think it's plainly mistaken. And we know it's possible to persuade people of this because people clearly have been persuaded to not have children. Now, that's not to say we can persuade everyone, of course, but even if you convince just one person or one couple not to reproduce, that's not negligible, right? This incidentally becomes very obvious if one considers the fact that humans can multiply. And so what begins as one child can, over several generations, add up to many more. Benatar has pointed out in this connection that if we assume every couple has 3 children, in a mere 10 generations, over 88,000 descendants will have stemmed from that original couple's decision to reproduce. And that's indeed a lot of preventable suffering. Others object to antinatalism on the grounds that human beings can and ought to phase out suffering on this planet. There is, as we know, a vast amount of suffering in nature, suffering experienced by other animals, that is. And that suffering will continue to exist even if or after humans die out. And so the worry is that if humans die out, no one will be here to do anything about this suffering. I think there are a number of possible responses to this, but I suppose one way to respond to this concern is simply to point out that antinatalism won't lead to human extinction. At any rate, it seems to me very unlikely that humans will ever die out due to non-procreation, although humans might die out in other involuntary ways. So I would say while these concerns about antinatalism may be of theoretical interest, they're not really of practical interest. Other objections to antinatalism come in the form of what one might call metaphysical speculations. For example, some have claimed that we actually choose to be born. What they mean, presumably, is that individuals consciously decide in some pre-birth or otherworldly existence whether they want to go through life or not, and upon entering the world, lose all memory of this decision. And so the suggestion is that no one is brought into existence without their consent. But is there any evidence or argument that can establish the credibility of such a belief? Well, certainly none that I'm aware of. It therefore seems to me that these sorts of beliefs really arise out of one's desire to justify or rationalize these existing practices. The secular community is often no less guilty of indulging in this sort of fanciful, wishful speculating. We frequently hear from atheists and secularists things such as the following. Everything happens for the best. The universe is morally ordered. Life can be wonderful if we just learn how to appreciate the little things, and so on and so forth. Again, I see no reason to think that any of these claims are true. Why then do people believe such things? Well, I think for the same reason religious people believe in things like redemption. Namely, it makes us feel better to believe that goodness will ultimately win out, or that we're somehow favored by fortune. It's a coping mechanism, I think. We find ourselves in this very unpleasant and difficult situation, and what is our natural response? Our immediate response is to look for help, to look for a way out. And when hope of this kind cannot be sourced from reality, we either come to terms with the wretchedness of existence and abandon hope in it. In effect, we become pessimists about our existence. Or we allow ourselves to be deceived by some falsehood about reality that will ease our misery, even if only slightly. The second option leads to optimism. And while I do think optimism can occasionally make people less unhappy, this denial, this refusal to acknowledge the harsh truths of existence, comes at a terrible price. Because it is this denial that is in large part, I think, responsible for the uncritical acceptance of suffering, our own as well as others. Against this, the antinatalist argues that what one ought to do is not to shrink from the appalling reality, but to acknowledge it and to develop an ethic based on this clearer understanding or clearer picture of the world. And while I don't expect to change my views on procreation, I do nevertheless think it's important to consider seriously any objections to the position that may come up, and to be in the habit of scrutinizing views of this kind that we hold. John Stuart Mill, in the well-known essay on liberty, makes the point exceptionally well, I think. However unwillingly a person who has a strong opinion may admit the possibility that their opinion may be false, they ought to be moved by the consideration that, however true it may be, if it is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth. So that is all for now, and thanks again for listening.